Hello, folks. As Monty Python would say, and now for something completely different. I'm going to be reading to you from my science fiction novel that I've been working on for the past 20 years. And I'm starting to come towards the end of it now. I'm just finishing off the third attempt at editing, and this time I'm determined to try and get it published. I'm going to be publishing a chapter at a time, and obviously I won't be doing reading a chapter in one full go as I record it, so that's why you'll probably see some maybe changes to my clothing or the lighting, etc. I hope you'll enjoy it, so get yourself a glass of your favourite tipple or a cup of your favourite hot drink, whichever. Sit back and listen as we go through The Great Tara Warrior. Chapter 1. It was like winning the lottery. Our story starts in the year of our Lord, 2035, just as that year's summer was slowly coming to an end, and the darker mornings of autumn were only just around the corner. Even so, it was still quite warm and sunny for 7 o'clock in the morning, and it was these same bright rays of late summer sunshine streaming through Barry Langstone's bedroom window and shining in his eyes, which was one reason why he decided to leave his comfortable double bed somewhat earlier than he would have normally done on a Saturday morning. Another reason why Barry decided to leave his bed earlier than usual that morning was because as he lay there thinking about what he was going to do with his day once he had got over the hangover he was suffering from, he suddenly remembered having bumped into his girlfriend Holly in the first bar he had gone into at the start of the evening, and that he had arranged something with her, but for the life of him he could not remember what it was. "It will come back to me," he said to himself, and as predicted, moments later he remembered with a bit of a panic what it was he was trying to remember. It was that Holly was coming round today instead of tomorrow, and she was due to arrive by 10 o'clock. Normally they like to meet up 3 or 4 times a week at either Barry's house or Holly's house, and whoever's home they were at, that person would cook the dinner. Occasionally they would go round to his daughter Adele's home and have dinner with her. But this did not happen very often because after all Adele had a family of her own to look after. However, the reason for this change of date and Barry's panic was that on this day they were to celebrate the fact that they had been together for 5 years. And so Barry had promised Holly he would prepare for her one of his famous roast beef dinners, along with all the trimmings as well as his famous plum and amaretto crumble. The reason why Barry was suffering from an hangover in the first place was as a consequence of the large amounts of alcohol which he had consumed at the stag party which he, along with his closest friend Big Al, had attended the night before. And the reason for having this stag party was because Big Al, as he was known among his closest friends, but whose real name was Alan Stanford, was getting married on the following Tuesday to his girlfriend of 2 years, Priscilla Marjorie Green. I should add at this point, however, that this was not Alan's first marriage, as he had been married twice before. Once when he was in his mid-20s and again when he was in his late 30s, with both marriages ending after only a couple of years. As well as Barry and Big Al, there were 3 other people in attendance at Big Al's stag party. One of these was Barry's other closest friend, Stephen Bourne, and the other 2 were the Gibbs brothers, Leroy and Jethro, who had been invited by Stephen because they were friends of his, as well as fellow pilots who also worked at Milchester Airport. As the arrangements which Barry had made with Holly came flooding back to him, he realised that if he hoped to have any chance of getting the meat into the oven by 10 o'clock, which he knew he would have to do if he hoped to be able to have everything ready in time for when he and Ollie were due to sit down for lunch at 12:30, he needed to arrive back from his morning walk by 9:30 at the very latest. Therefore, with this in mind, Barry finally pulled himself completely out of his bed, and as he did so, he once again had to shield his eyes against the glare of that bright morning sun, while at the same time thinking to himself, "Damn it, it's time I got some curtains for those windows." As his feet hit the cold floor and the feeling of being sick from the hangover he was suffering from started to subside, he started to remember with a little bit of embarrassment some of the events from the previous evening. One of those events that Barry would most like to forget was when at the end of the evening he spent some 5 minutes running around that final venue's car park, saying over and over, "Damn it guys, someone's stolen my car." That was until the guys who were as drunk as he was realised what he was going on about, at which point Alan pointed out to him that he no longer had a car, as he had sold it the previous month, and in fact they had arrived at that first stop of the evening by taxi, and they had even arranged to go home the same way. As Barry sat there on the edge of the bed with these thoughts going through his mind, naked apart from a pair of boxer shorts, which was the way he slept during the summer months, it took several seconds before he realised how cold the floor was. And as this fact started to sink in, it made him jump a little, which brought him back to reality. And noticing the time by the large red clock on the wall at the foot of his bed, and realising that he really needed to make a start, he finally stood up and made his way into the bathroom, where first he had a shave and then he took a shower. With his morning ablutions completed, he replaced the boxer shorts with a fresh pair, having dropped the old pair into the laundry basket just inside the bathroom door. He then put on his favourite grey tracksuit bottoms with the side pockets, which he loved to wear around the house until after breakfast. He also put on a blue shirt and slipped his feet into a pair of old dark green trainers before proceeding downstairs to make his breakfast. He would of course put on what he called his street clothes when he returned from his walk, as was his way. The house consisted of 3 floors, with the top floor having 2 bedrooms, a bathroom with a separate toilet, and a box room, and the largest of the 2 bedrooms, which faced the back of the house and was south facing so it got most of the sun in the morning, was Barry's bedroom. Apart from a double bed, a chair, a bedside table and the built-in wardrobe, the room contained no other furniture, and at the time the room also had no carpet. Barry had a new one on order, and it was due to be delivered the following Friday, but having got the delivery wrong, mistaking it for last Friday, he had thrown the old carpet out the day before. Hence Barry's problem with cold feet. The second of the 2 bedrooms faced the front of the house, and it was as sparsely furnished as the main bedroom, except that it had a wooden wardrobe, not a built-in one like the main bedroom. And Barry used his second bedroom mostly for storage, although he had been known to tidy it up whenever he had over the occasional guest, such as Alan or Stephen. I should add that owing to the fact that Holly would sometimes stay overnight and would let him know in no uncertain terms that she was not impressed with the decor of the room, he had started to purchase other items of furniture which were on order at the time. On the ground floor there was a living room, a kitchen, a dining room, a downstairs toilet, and below ground was a cellar. The house itself was said to be almost 200 years old, making it one of the oldest buildings in the village, the oldest being the church. As I say, the reason why Barry wanted to cook this special meal for Holly was because this was the 5th anniversary of them being together as a couple. But also, when Big Al had told him 3 weeks ago about his up-and-coming wedding, it had made Barry feel a little guilty that despite the fact that he loved Holly with all of his heart, he still had not yet asked her to marry him. And so he had decided that on this 5th anniversary of them being together as a couple, he would correct this omission and ask Holly to be his wife. And with this in mind, he had spent the last 2 weeks trying to find the right ring, which he had been unable to do. And so he had arranged for one to be specially made, which he had collected 2 days ago. The ring consisted of Holly's birthstone, which was a ruby, set in the centre of the ring, and was surrounded by 6 sapphires, which was Barry's birthstone, and the whole thing was encased in a gold setting. And when Barry designed the ring, he thought to himself, "This is going to cost me more than my last car." But he quickly reminded himself that Holly was definitely worth every penny it was costing him, and a lot more beside. Holly is approximately 5 years younger than Barry and stands 5 feet 11 inches tall in her bare feet. She has shoulder-length auburn hair, which for some unknown reason Barry seems to think always smells of sweet jasmine. Her eyes are deep blue-green in colour, although when Barry has consumed much more alcohol than is good for him, he will often describe them as come-to-bed eyes. And if he is overheard saying this by Holly, she will reprimand him in no uncertain terms as he hangs his head in shame. She has a heart-shaped birthmark on the top of her left buttock, and so she rarely wears a thong-type swimming costume. And whenever Barry tells her it looks sexy, Holly will give him a playful slap across the back of his head with the comment, "Don't be cheeky." Although she is now in her 50s, Holly still does quite a lot of exercise, such as going horse riding or riding her bike. And she also likes to go jogging. And as a result of all this exercise, she still has a neat, trim figure and a well-proportioned body, which makes her look more like someone in their 30s than someone in their 50s. Barry once made the mistake of saying she looked as fit as a butcher's dog, which earned him a hard slap across his face. And although she quickly said she was sorry, and the pair of them laughed about it as Barry rubbed his sore red cheek, nonetheless he never made that mistake again, I can tell you, as when she wanted to, Holly could pack quite a punch. Holly had been married before, but is now a widow, as her husband, who had been a private contractor working in Afghanistan, had been killed over there when a building he was inspecting collapsed on him. This had happened almost 2 years before Barry and Holly had even met, and although Holly had been married for just over 10 years at the time of her husband's untimely death, they had never had any children, which was something Holly would often say was her biggest regret. Barry had first met Holly while he was working as a senior lecturer at Milchester College. She had just joined the staff as a junior lecturer 2 days before, and after completing her 2-day induction course, Barry was given the task of being her mentor for the remainder of her 6-month probationary period. Although Barry took a liking to Holly from the very first moment they met, nonetheless, it still took him several weeks before he managed to pluck up the courage to ask her out on a date, and even then he was somewhat surprised when she said yes. When Barry met up with his friends Stephen and Alan the next day, following that first day, he told them that the evening had been a great success, and he was sure that he had found his soulmate, and that one day he was going to ask her to marry him. Since their first date, Barry is now retired, but Holly, on the other hand, is still teaching at Milchester College, although it's now only part-time, 3 days a week. Barry's friendship with Alan had started over 50 years ago when they were children living on the same street in the small town of Donegate. Alan is a year younger than Barry and is 5 feet 11 inches tall. His hair is greyish-black in the form of dreadlocks. His eyes are brown and he has a small greyish beard. And despite his age, he's still working full-time as a professor at the University of Milchester. Although at Christmas he told Barry he was going to retire at the end of the current academic year. Barry's friendship with Stephen, however, had only started 35 years ago when they first met while attending the same army recruitment course before going on to serve in the same Special Forces unit. Stephen is approximately 7 years younger than Barry and works as a pilot for one of the biggest airlines of the day. He is almost 6 feet tall with short jet black hair and dark brown eyes. Also, while in his early 20s, he had broken his nose while playing rugby, and unfortunately it had not been set properly, leaving it a little bent, and of course he never got round to getting it fixed. When he first started working at Milchester Airport, some of the girls teased him by saying it made him look a lot like the actor Danny Craig Jr. And when he told his wife, Wendy, what the girls had said, she fell about laughing, saying, "You wish you were that good looking." And not seeing the funny side, he did not speak to her for several days, which gives you an idea of his temperament. Barry, or Bazza as he was often referred to by his two closest friends Alan and Stephen, had just turned 60 the previous June, and it was shortly after his 60th birthday that Barry had taken the opportunity to retire on a full pension. So now he considered himself a man of leisure, so to speak. Barry stood 5 feet 10 inches tall in his bare feet, but in his youth he had been closer to 6 feet. Although he still has all of his own hair, I am sorry to say that he's now a lot thinner and turning grey, but at one time his hair had been quite thick and dark brown in colour. And even though these days it is a lot thinner, he still keeps it cut short, like when he was in the army, a habit which he had never quite gotten out of. However, before he joined the army, he tended to follow the fashions of the day, which often meant having it quite long. Barry's hair had first started to turn grey a little after his 49th birthday. However, while he was still working at Milchester College, he had been in the habit of dyeing it brown. But sometimes he would forget, with the result that the grey would start to show through again. And so when he re-dyed it brown again and the students spotted this change in colour, they would ask him if he had dyed his hair, to which he would laugh and say no, telling them that it was now brown again because he had stopped dyeing it grey, which often would get a good laugh from his students. Barry's eyes are deep blue in colour, and like when he was younger, he can still give you a piercing look when he has a mind to. But these days, of course, his eyesight is no longer as sharp as it was, and so naturally he needs to wear glasses. But in his youth, oh boy, those same deep blue eyes had made many a young female swoon, I can tell you. Up to last year, Barry still had most of his own teeth, but just lately he had started to lose a number of them, which was mostly down to his fondness for boiled sweets, which Holly was always telling him off about. One of the results of Barry losing his teeth was that he tended not to smile as often as he used to, although he had recently made arrangements for these missing teeth to be replaced with gold implants, and this work was due to take place over the next 2 months. Also, another downside to Barry's fondness for boiled sweets is that he is no longer as slim as he was back in his youth. In fact, it could be said that he had started to develop a bit of a beer belly. However, that being said, he was not yet what you would call obese, but more well built, with quite a lot of muscle and still relatively fit for a man of his age. Even so, Ollie was still pushing him to go on a diet. Although in his youth Barry had come close a number of times to getting a tattoo, he had, unlike many of his friends, managed to resist this temptation, and so as a result he has no distinctive marks on his skin other than the odd scar picked up in the many fights that he had gotten into during his early years, as he was known for having quite a temper. Mind you, even now you still did not want to get on the wrong side of him. Also, apart from the odd scar, his skin is blemish-free and still quite smooth for a man of his age. Another habit that Barry had picked up from his time in the army was that he always started each day with a shave, and like his hairstyle, he had never quite gotten out of it. That said, at one point he did have facial hair, in that he had a moustache, which he grew once he made it to the rank of corporal. He did not want to do this, but he had no choice, because it was one of those unwritten rules that when you made corporal you grew a moustache. If anyone was to ask him after he left the army why he got rid of the moustache or never grew a beard, he would just laugh and say it was so the girls could see how good looking he was. Although in reality he thought that facial hair made him look a lot older than he really was. Among his closest friends and the people of the village, Barry was well known for his wicked sense of humour. In fact, when he prepaid for his funeral 2 years previously, he wanted to have the inscription, "Here lies an atheist, all dressed up and nowhere to go," carved on his gravestone. That was until Alan pointed out to him that this had already been done. And Barry, being the type of person he was, he wanted to remain unique, requesting that the inscription, "Life's a bitch and then you snuff it," be inscribed instead. Barry, like his girlfriend Holly Rain, had also been married once before, and this marriage had taken place while he was in his mid-20s. At that time, Barry was still living in Leeds, which was the city of his birth, and his bride-to-be was also from Leeds, and her name was Laura Branson. Barry had first met Laura while on a shopping trip to his local supermarket, and it was as he wandered around the aisles looking for the bread counter that he quite literally bumped into Laura by crashing his trolley into hers. The reason why he was not concentrating on what he was doing as he wandered the aisles was because he was still in a state of deep depression over the loss of his first love, Lucy Bradshaw, who had disappeared in mysterious circumstances 5 months earlier. And this was the first time he had left the house since that day. As fate would have it, another reason why Barry crashed into Laura's trolley was because Laura was also not concentrating on what she was doing, as she came down the same aisle from the opposite direction, and so she did not notice Barry heading straight for her. However, as the two trolleys crashed into each other, Barry, being Barry, immediately took responsibility for the crash and apologised, and for a few seconds they continued to stand there smiling at each other, neither of them knowing what to say next, until Barry, never being one to miss an opportunity, gave a little cough and introduced himself, before asking her if he could buy her a drink in the way of an apology. And to his everlasting surprise, she smiled, told him her name, and said yes. It was during their second date a week later that Barry told Laura about his recent loss, and she in turn told him how she was also getting over a loss of her own, which was that her mother had died from breast cancer the month before, and so the two of them were able to comfort each other. So much so that within 7 months of that second date, they were married, and a further 11 months later, on the 15th of October 2003, Laura gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, who they named Adele after Laura's late mother. However, their happiness was destined not to last, because a little over 2 years after Adele was born, Laura was killed as she made her way home after visiting her mum's grave. She had just pulled up at the crossing at the top of their street, and as she waited for the lights to turn green, she was knocked off her bike by a drunk driver, and she died later that evening in the same hospital where she worked as a midwife. And so with the loss of Laura, Barry was left to bring up Adele on his own. And the worst part about the whole affair was that the driver of the car that killed her, despite being drunk at the time, only got 2 years in jail for dangerous driving. And the reason for this short sentence was because of a delay on the part of the police in breathalyzing him, with the result that when it came to court, they could not prove he was drunk at the time he hit Laura. Although as strange as it may seem, The same driver 10 years later was himself killed in a hit-and-run accident by yet another drunk driver, and when Barry read about it in the local paper, he turned to his friends and said with a big smile, "Ain't karma a bitch?" At the time of her death, Laura was only 26, and it hit Barry very hard, coming as it did only 5.5 years after losing Lucy. So much so that he started to believe that he was jinxed, and so after losing yet another love in tragic circumstances, Barry decided that the gods of love were very much against him, and that it was his destiny to remain a widower and never to have another successful relationship. That was until the day romance once again came knocking and he met Holly Rain. Meanwhile, the years passed and Adele grew up to become the living image of her mother. And even though Adele is now approaching 32, she still looks a lot like her. She stands 5 feet 6 inches tall, and just like her mother did, she has thick, shoulder-length red hair. Also like her mother, she has dark brown eyes with the same mischievous twinkle that she would use to good effect whenever she wanted to get her dad to do something he didn't want to do. And even though Barry would often say how Adele looked like her mother, his friends would tell him that they felt she looked a lot more like him. Adele has been working as a nurse for the past 5 years at the hospital in Milchester, but before she got homesick and decided to move back to the family home in Leaford, she had worked for 2 years at the Parkstone General Infirmary just outside London. It was while she was working at the Parkstone General Infirmary that she first briefly met Dr. Phil Watson as they passed each other on one of the wards, but it was to be another 6 months before she would see him again, because the day after that first meeting, he left London to set up his own practice in the Yorkshire town of Bamford. The next meeting, some 6 months later, occurred purely by chance when Adele attended a party being given by some of Dr. Phil Watson's friends. And Adele had only been at the party for 5 minutes when she noticed Phil standing in a corner on his own, and so with her heart beating madly, as she told her best friend Margie Simpson when they met for coffee the next day, she went up to him and started chatting. As they chatted and she mentioned their previous encounter, he told her he remembered seeing her that day and that he had thought just how beautiful she was, which made Adele blush, but despite thinking he was being a bit soppy, by the end of the evening Adele had decided that he was the man for her. But as they talked, she realised how shy he was and that he was not going to make the first move. So she took the initiative and asked him out, and naturally he said yes. And so it was that within a year of that first day they were married, and a year after that Adele gave birth to a daughter who she named Hermione after Adele's grandmother. Hermione is the double of her mother when Adele was her age, right down to the long curly red locks and dark brown eyes. And it goes without saying that Hermione is the apple of her father's eye. And like her mother with her father, she can wrap her father around her little finger when she has a mind to. After deciding to move from Leeds to Leaford, one of the things that convinced Barry and Laura to buy the house, which they did, was its layout of the ground floor, in that it had a hallway which ran from front to back, with the living room at the front and the kitchen at the back and the dining room between the two. Also, it had a toilet under the stairs. Another thing they liked was the staircase being halfway down the hallway, so that you did not bump into it as you came in through the front door. Plus, when the kitchen door was open, you could see right through to the back garden. Although over the years Barry had taken many photos of the family, the one he was the proudest of was the one of him and Adele taken on her wedding day in front of the church. so much so that he had a half life-size copy made and which he hung in the space between the front door and the staircase. The two other photos he loved the most after the wedding day photo was the ones of Adele and Hermione, both taken when they were 4 and both sitting on a donkey on the beach in Scarborough. Barry had these two photos printed as posters and they were hung on opposite sides of the living room, and whenever he had visitors they would often remark how very much alike they looked. In fact, they would often confuse one with the other. Ever since Barry and Laura moved to the picturesque county village of Leaford 20 years ago, he would, on the weekend when the weather was fine or at least dry, like to take a brisk walk in the rolling hills which stretched out for several miles behind the village, and this morning was to be no exception. So after Barry had eaten a hearty breakfast, which as most mornings consisted of 2 large free-range scrambled eggs on warm brown toast with the edges cut off, and washed down with a large cup of strong Yorkshire tea with milk and 1 sugar, although he had been trying to give up the sugar since the start of the year, but with very little success, I might add. Then, as was his habit, after finishing his breakfast, Barry spent the next 10 minutes or so on the phone chatting with Adele, which was something he would do on those mornings whenever Adele was on a late shift at the hospital. And sometimes when he had nothing to say, he would, as a joke, say he had just rung to let her know he was still alive and kicking, which would make her laugh. But mostly it was just to hear a voice, as somehow it helped set him up for the rest of the day. After Barry had finished speaking with Adele, he would also, during the summer holidays, like to spend a few moments chatting with his granddaughter Hermione. Although now that she had reached the tender age of 11, she would often have her friends round for a sleepover, and so she would be too busy to spend time chatting with her granddad, as was the case this particular morning. After his conversation with Dell came to an end and he was about to leave, he noticed that he had a small egg stain on his top and another on his tracksuit bottoms, and being a bit of a perfectionist, he decided he needed to change his clothes. After returning to his bedroom, he spent the next 10 minutes sorting through his clothes before deciding on that day's second outfit, which was his Leeds United sweatshirt, a team he had followed since he was 15, a pair of light blue Nike running shorts with the side pockets, which he had purchased on one of his many holiday trips to Florida, and a pair of dark blue Air Max trainers. Having made his selection, Barry quickly changed into his fresh clothes and returned to the kitchen. And having returned to the kitchen, his intention was to leave the house via the back door, then make his way down the single path made from flags of blue stone with a rather splendid patch of lawn on each side. Also, each patch of lawn was in turn surrounded by a bed of brightly coloured flowers, which Barry had spent the last 10 years cultivating. At the end of the path was a wooden gate which was in a poor state of repair, and despite his good intentions, even after 5 years of it being in this condition, he still had not got round to fixing it. However, before he had even got halfway across the kitchen, he was stopped dead in his tracks by the sound of the front doorbell. With the sound of the bell ringing in his ears, Barry's first impulse was to ignore it. But as he stood there wondering what to do next, the bell rang again, and this time with what Barry considered to be a much more persistent ring. So after thinking to himself that he should really go and see who it was in case it was something important, he reluctantly returned back through the hallway to the front door. And as it turned out, it was a good job he did, because to his surprise, when he opened the door, there standing on the doorstep was Holly. After a moment's pause, Barry stepped to one side to let her in, saying, "Oh, I thought you were not coming over until 10 o'clock. And on seeing the look of surprise on his face, Holly, as she passed him, gave him a playful slap on his arm, saying, I knew with all that drinking you were doing last night, you were bound to forget what we'd agreed on. And as the look on Barry's face turned from one of surprise to one of confusion, she went on to explain how they had agreed that because on this occasion, as there was so much prep work to be done, she would come round at 8:30 instead of 10. That way she could start getting things ready while he went for his morning walk. After a few moments of realisation, a sheepish grin came over Barry's face, as if to say, of course, now I remember. While at the same time he gave her a big hug and kissed her, saying, my love, as usual, you are right, I confess I did forget. And after asking her to forgive him, he promised that he would do his part when he returned from his walk. Of course, you would have thought that in the circumstances, the most natural thing for Barry to do would have been to cancel his walk, and for a brief moment this thought did cross his mind. But Holly, seeing him hesitate at the kitchen door and knowing how much he loved to spend time upon Dawkins Mount, she waved at him, saying, no, my love, go for your walk. I will be fine, and besides, you need the fresh air after last night. Which made Barry laugh, and so after giving her another kiss, Barry picked up his silver-handled walking cane and finally left the house. Little did he know at the time, but when he left the house that bright sunny morning, it was to be the last time he would see his family and friends for a very long time, and Holly would never get to enjoy that promised meal or get that promised proposal, because he was about to have the greatest adventure of his, or anyone else's life for that matter. As Barry reached the end of the garden path, he took a moment to look back, and as he did so, he could see Holly waving to him from the kitchen window. And it was at this point that he decided that today, when he reached Dawkins Mount, he was not going to stay for his usual hour, as he felt it would not be right to leave Holly on her own to do most of the work. After all, he'd invited her, not the other way around. Also, another reason for cutting short his walk was that he still had to prepare the beef before it went into the oven. And so, with this in mind, and one final wave to Holly, he set off, and after trying and failing to close the gate behind him, he started to make his way down the lane that ran behind his house. However, he did not get far, as he was stopped by his next-door neighbours, George and Jackie Simmons, who were relaxing in their back garden, as was their habit most weekends during the summer. Although during the winter they liked to spend their time in Florida, as they had a villa out there. And despite being in a hurry to get back, he still remembered his manners, and so he spent several minutes chatting with the Simmons until he said he was sorry, but he just had to go. I should add at this point, dear reader, that naturally Holly was quite capable of preparing the beef herself, but loving him as she did, and knowing how he felt that cooking the meat was his job, she always left him to it. After Barry had finished chatting with the Simmons, he continued on down the lane until he reached the large green expanse known as Cowden Common, and he was about to enter the common when a large red BMW car pulled up alongside him, and Barry's first thoughts were that it was someone wanting directions. That was until the driver's window came down and a face in dark glasses appeared, which made him take a step backwards until he realised that the driver was Stephen and the passenger was Alan. Barry said, "I see you have a new car then," to which Stephen nodded and told Barry that there was no need to shout, before going on to say that they were going fishing to clear their heads after last night's drinking, and asked Barry if he would like to come with them. Barry said that it sounded like a really good idea, but this time he would have to give it a miss, as he was having lunch with Holly, and she had already arrived, to which Stephen said with a cheeky grin, "Don't wear her out." "I don't know what you mean," said Barry, laughing, and as they started to walk away, Stephen shouted, "She's too good for you, man. You should marry that woman before someone else takes her off you." "Don't worry, I intend to," Barry shouted back, laughing and waving to them as the car pulled away, and as it disappeared round the corner at the end of the street and into the main road leading to the Great Winston Dam, Barry continued on his journey, taking his usual route up to Dawkins Mount. As Barry walked across the common, he waved to the few people who were about at that time of the day, which were mostly people out walking their dogs. And as Barry knew many of these people personally, they would usually wave back with a friendly greeting of their own. After leaving the common, Barry cut through the small wood which backs onto the common and is known locally as Lover's Lane, but its correct name is Beckett's Grove. The grove, which runs across the base of the Childer Hills for about 5 kilometres in either direction from its main point of entry, has a single footpath running through it and covers an area of approximately 25 square kilometres. And although the grove is a popular spot, often used in the evening by courting couples, it is normally deserted at that time of the day, just as it was this morning, which meant that Barry was able to quickly make his way through the grove without meeting another soul. And once clear of the grove, Barry followed the footpath known as Dawkins Stairway, as it wound its way up to the top of Dawkins Mount. The path had quite a steep climb to it. In fact, it was so steep that over the past couple of years, a number of people visiting the area for the first time had complained to the council of having taken a bit of a tumble. And so to help prevent this happen again, the council had recently dug a number of concrete steps into the footpath at various stages of the climb, to add to the wooden handrail which had been erected at the start of the year. The first thing Barry would have normally done after arriving at the top of Dawkins Stairway would have been to stand for a few moments and take in the view. However, this morning, as he reached the top of the climb, he was a little out of breath owing to the fact that he was, to a certain extent, still suffering from the hangover. So instead, he immediately sat down on the small wooden bench placed there by the council the year before. Once seated, the first thing he did was to check his watch, and he was a little surprised as he calculated that the journey of 2.5 kilometres from his house in Leaford had taken him 37 minutes. And the reason for his surprise was that he would have normally covered the same distance, even walking at a steady pace, in around 25 minutes. The more Barry thought about it, the more he realised that considering he was still suffering from the hangover, this time of 37 minutes was not such a bad time after all, especially considering how many times he had to stop as he climbed Dawkins Stairway. The bench that Barry was sitting on had been erected in remembrance of a young man from Leaford called John McFadden, and although he had moved away from Leaford when he was 18, when he was killed fighting for his country in the Third Iraq War, the village decided that they should honour him in some way, which they did with the bench, although some people thought it would have been a stone monument erected in the centre of the village. In the event, this bench had only been possible after the villagers organised a collection, along with several fundraising events throughout the year. The reason why the villagers had to do this was because the local council, despite claiming to be in favour, were only willing to provide half the required funds, which left most people to suspect that the council were not really in favour of the idea at all, and had only provided the support they did was because of the high number of tourists who visited Dawkins Mount, complaining of having nowhere to sit, As a result, several of the council lost their seat at the next election. As Barry slowly started to get his breathing back under control, the throbbing in his head finally started to subside as the headache tablets he had taken just before leaving the house started to take effect. And at the same time, the feeling of being sick also started to fade. And so, with his head now a lot clearer, he finally took the time to look around the valley spread out below. And as he did so, he told himself that this great view had been well worth the time and effort it had taken him to get there. Although Barry had sat on this very spot many times before, he never failed to appreciate those great views which would change from season to season. And as he admired the view spread out below, he would always say the same thing to himself. If this great county of Yorkshire isn't God's own county, then I don't know where is. In the far distance, on a clear day like it was today, you could just make out in the nearby market town of Draxstone the top of Garstein Minster, which the local historians, when asked, would tell you that it was built by the Normans. Although the local kids, if asked, would, with a cheeky grin, say it was built by Barretts. Along the valley floor ran the long and winding Moxon Brook, starting just outside Draxton and ending at Leaford, and shimmering in the warm sunlight like it was this morning. It looked more like a mirror than a river, and although the brook was always quite low at that time of year, in the late autumn and early winter it had been known to become a raging torrent, and had even been known from time to time to break its banks. And when it did, it would flood the land on either side for hundreds of metres in all directions. In fact, it was during one such flood 5 years ago, when the area was experiencing a really bad winter, that the water level in the brook rose so high that it broke its banks with such force that a group of 10 tourists who had gone out walking that morning were caught out by this sudden rise in the water level and were cut off from the main road. And I am sad to say that before they could be rescued, 3 of the party were drowned. To the left of the valley stood Barry's own picturesque village of Leaford, and several of its buildings had been there since the time of the Normans. And one such building, which Barry could clearly see, owing to its position on the edge of the village, was the old Norman church of St. Kevin of the Temple Mount. Also, if you were to look to the far right of the valley, you could see the Great Winston Dam, and stretching out from the wall of the dam for over 2 kilometres was a large arc-shaped lake known as Winterbourne Water. And from the first Saturday in April to the last Saturday in September, it was very popular with the water sport and fishing fraternity. As Barry sat there looking out across the valley while trying to decide how much longer he could stay there before he had to make his way back, his gaze alighted on the dam in the distance, and as he did so, he could just make out 2 figures sat by the side of the dam in what appeared to be fishing gear. And as he watched them, he thought, that has to be a Stephen and Alan. I hope they didn't drink too much and fall in frightening the fish. And as he did so, he started to laugh, as in his mind's eye, he could just see them falling into the water with a bottle of beer in one hand and a fishing rod in the other. Between Leaford and the Great Winston Dam stretched the famous Tamworth marshlands, which in the spring was very popular with the bird watching fraternity. And it could even be said that the dam and the marshlands between them accounted for some 75% of the area's tourist industry. Approximately 250 metres to the rear of where Barry was sitting stood the Great Osborne Wood, which in April and May was full of bluebells, carpeting the floor in a wonderful sea of blue. In fact, the bluebells were so plentiful at that time of the year that the locals often referred to the wood as the Great Bluebell Wood. The wood was said to be very old, and in fact, many historians believed that most of the trees had been planted around the time when Britain was ruled by the Romans. Sadly, these days, the wood only covers an area of just over 25 square kilometres, but as little as 200 years ago, it had covered the area of over 6,000 square kilometres. As Barry continued to admire the wonderful view, while at the same time soaking up the rays of the warm summer sun, trying to get back the suntan he had achieved the previous summer while on his holiday in Orlando, Florida, he reluctantly checked his watch and said, "Come on, Barry, me old fruit, it's time we were getting back." And as he stood up to go, he suddenly became aware of a large dark shadow which had appeared directly over the spot where he was sitting, and which in turn was blocking out the sun, thus making him shiver a little owing to the sudden drop in temperature. At first, Barry thought of nothing of this sudden drop in temperature, thinking that it was nothing more than a stray cloud which had passed over the sun and which would very quickly move on. However, after standing up to leave, Barry realised that the shadow had not moved on. So to see why this was, he looked up, and to his surprise, and also with a little bit of horror I might add, he saw what at first appeared to be a large saucer-shaped object hovering approximately 200 metres directly above his head. For several moments, Barry just stood there transfixed, staring at what was obviously some kind of non-terrestrial spacecraft hovering silently above him. But after several minutes of this inactivity, Barry finally pulled himself together and, thinking of Corporal Jones in Dad's army, gave a nervous laugh and started shouting, "Don't panic, don't panic," over and over, until he finally got a grip of himself, allowing his heartbeat to return to normal, which in turn allowed him to think more clearly about just what it was he was looking at. Now feeling much calmer, Barry slowly took several steps away from the bench in the direction of Osborne's Wood. And as he did so, he suddenly remembered the small camera which he always had with him wherever he went, and despite having the urge to run like mad, he stopped and removed the camera from his pocket. The reason why Barry had developed this habit of always carrying a camera wherever he went was because of an incident which took place some 30 years ago when he was on one of his many walking holidays in Cornwall. The incident in question occurred while he was making his way back to his hotel, and as he did so, he came upon a large fishing trawler. And what was unusual about this was that the fishing trawler was 3 kilometres inland and had obviously been dropped there by a great storm which had battered the coast the day before. Although the story of the fishing trawler had been big news at the time, the council had already removed it by the time that anyone from the national press arrived on the scene, and so this made Barry's picture quite valuable, enabling him to sell the picture to a major newspaper for the princely sum of £200. After taking the camera out of his pocket and overcoming his natural instinct to run, which I am sure most people would have done in the same circumstances, he started taking as many pictures of this mysterious flying object as he could, and as he did so, he kept telling himself over and over, "These pictures will be worth a fortune, if I survive, that is." He quickly added with a smile, while at the same time backing away a few feet so as to get a better view of this unknown craft. After taking several pictures, Barry decided it was now time to leave, so he turned round and set off running in a zigzag pattern for the cover of the Osborne Wood, clutching the camera in his right hand as he did so. Of course, he would have liked to have taken many more pictures, but he was far too busy running to get any clear shots, and by now he was starting to get somewhat concerned for his own safety. And as they say, retreat is the better part of valour. As Barry neared the cover of the wood, he looked back over his shoulder, and as he did so, he could see that this strange craft had started to follow him. And before he could reach the cover of the wood, the craft darted in front of him, cutting him off from the wood. As Barry came to a stop, wondering which way to run next, he knew he only had 3 options. 1, run back to Dawkins Stairway and hide in Beckett's Grove. 2, push on to the Great Osborne Wood. Or 3, try to make it across the open grassland to the right of Osborne Wood, known as Bogden Moor. The Bogden Moor option, of course, was a non-starter, as it stretched for over 30 kilometres until it reached the Great North Road. Barry also decided that the stairway was too far away, leaving him with option 2, which was to try and reach Osborne Wood, and so he plucked up his courage and made a dart for the wood. And as he did so, the craft once again darted in front of him, trying to cut him off. Although, strangely enough, at the time, Bazin's main concern was making it to the safety of the wood without dropping his camera, rather than what this unknown craft was doing. No matter which way Barry ran, the craft continued to follow him, until gradually he reached a point where he felt he was now close enough to reach the safety of the wood should he feel that the craft was about to attack him. As he stood there feeling he was no longer in immediate danger of being attacked, his curiosity slowly started to get the better of him, and he decided that his best course of action was to stand still. That way he could get an even better look at this craft which, if he hadn't been before, he was now convinced that it had come from another world. And the more he thought about it, the more he thought that whoever was in this craft was probably just as curious about him as he was about them. Now that Barry was in a position to study the craft more closely, he was able to make out some of its main features, such as the fact that its shape was not saucer-shaped as he had first thought, but was in fact rather rectangular in shape, and the front end of the craft was semicircular in shape. And as Bazin took more photos, he judged that the craft was approximately 9 meters in length and around 5 meters wide. However, from his current position, he was unable to tell what the depth of the craft was. Nonetheless, he estimated it to be at least 1.5 times the height of an average person. As Barry continued taking pictures of this strange craft, and with all fear for the present now gone, he was able to observe that the underside of the craft appeared to be metallic grey in colour, and the rest of the craft, as far as he could see, appeared to be silver in colour. Also, another thing Barry noticed was that this craft had no windows or viewing ports of any kind, which Barry thought was not unusual for a ship designed to fly across outer space. As you can see, Barry had not yet considered the possibility that this was not the mothership. Barry also noticed that there wasn't any sign of the ship's landing gear, or even any openings where the gear could be retracted into. Also, the design of the craft, with its 2 short swept-back wings and high tail fin, reminded Barry of the old space shuttles. Apart from the 2 distinct colours, Barry could also see that the craft had no other markings by which you could identify where it had come from. Of course, even if there had been any markings, it would not have made any difference. As this being a spacecraft from another world, it is unlikely that Barry would have been able to understand them anyway. The one thing about this craft that really caught Barry's attention above everything else was just how silent it had been as it moved through the air when it had followed him in the direction of the Great Osborne Wood. And it was this silence which made him realise that there was no visible evidence of any kind of engine, or for that matter, any other method of powering the craft. It was at this point that Barry started to realise that this alien craft hovering in front of him was not the mothership, but as they say in the popular sci-fi pictures, was in fact only one of the mothership's smaller shuttlecrafts. And therefore there had to be a much larger mothership orbiting the planet, and which must have some kind of cloaking system, otherwise the government would have been all over it by now. After several more minutes of these observations, Barry decided to change his position to see if he could get a much clearer view of the ship's overall shape. But as he started to move in one direction, the craft in its turn moved in the opposite direction, as if it was trying to observe him in the same way he was trying to observe it. The result of this continuous changing of positions by the craft meant that Barry was unable to get into the right position by which he could get the overall view he was seeking. So after approximately 5 minutes of this slow dance that Barry and the strange craft had been participating in, he decided to give up and stand still, as it became obvious that this was getting him nowhere. At which point the craft suddenly moved from its position between him and the wood to a point within 2 meters of him and stopped as if it was deciding what to do next. Then after a few seconds it moved back to the position it had occupied when Barry had first become aware of its presence, leaving it hovering approximately 100 meters directly above him. Before Barry had the chance to react to this change in events, he was covered in a pale blue light which started to sweep over him in a side-to-side motion, and this went on for several seconds until just as suddenly as the blue light had appeared, it disappeared, leaving Barry with his hair sticking out like he had just had an electric shock, and also feeling a little sick. Then before Barry even had a chance to recover from the ordeal of the blue light, he became aware of a high-pitched sound which had started coming from the craft, and it was this high-pitched sound that finally snapped Barry out of his stupor, and he started running for the cover of the wood, as if his very life depended on it. However, he did not get far, as the craft soon caught up with him and hit him with an invisible beam, and try as he might, he was unable to break free of it. With his arms pinned to his side, as well as being unable to move his body in any direction, he felt as if he was being crushed, while at the same time making him feel as if he was transfixed to the ground. And as he struggled to break free, for the first time since the incident started, Barry started to get really frightened, and he even at one point thought he was going to wet himself. However, his old army training set in and he quickly regained his composure. Therefore, with his composure now regained and the adrenaline which had been pumping through his veins starting to fade, his love of adventure once more started to kick in, which in turn made him feel less frightened. But this state of calmness did not last long, as moments later he could feel his heart beating that fast that he thought it was going to burst out of his chest, or at the very least he was going to have an heart attack. So once again he tried to calm himself, and as his heartbeat slowed to a more natural rhythm, he started to wonder what was going to happen next. And as these thoughts passed through his mind, he realised the high-pitched sound had stopped and all the birds had gone silent. And even the sound from the wind blowing across Bogden Moor had also stopped, and all that he could hear was an eerie silence. As Barry stood there transfixed, he thought how deafening this silence was, and for a brief moment his fear once again started to return. But this new feeling of fear did not last long, because seconds later he was suddenly engulfed in a very bright light, leaving him even more rooted to the spot, as if he was paralysed from head to toe. As Barry tried and failed to break free of the beam that was holding him prisoner, he realised that the eerie silence was at last being broken by a strange humming noise, which he could clearly hear in the warm morning atmosphere of Dawkins Mount. And it seemed to him as if the world as he knew it had ceased to exist, and time itself was standing still. And for a brief moment he even thought he was dead. That was until he noticed that as well as the humming sound, there was a second, even louder sound, and as he realised what it was, he gave a little laugh, because the sound he could hear was that of his own heavy breathing. And as he tried to get his breathing back under control, that feeling of being sick came back, at which point he knew he was in deep trouble. And so he once again tried to break free, but his efforts weakened him that much that he passed out. When he came round again, it seemed to Barry as if he had been unconscious for a lifetime, but he had in fact only been unconscious for approximately 5 seconds. And it was then, as he tried to regather his thoughts, that he became aware that the bright beam of light had started to slowly draw him up towards this strange craft. And as his feet started to leave the ground, that feeling of panic started to return. Even so, despite his fear of heights, his love of adventure again took over, and he finally started to fully relax. As he slowly drifted up towards this alien craft, the humming sound suddenly got louder, and he felt as if he was being pulled apart piece by piece. And as he did so, he could not help but laugh at the unbelievable situation he now was in. In fact, it was only now that he finally understood what was happening to him. It was that he was being teleported aboard the craft, and just as this realization struck him, the world around him seemed for a brief moment to shimmer, and the eerie silence returned before he seemed to melt away in slow motion, starting with his feet, then his legs, and so on until he blacked out completely. This process, which in Barry's mind had seemed to take an hour, had only taken around 10 seconds. In fact, the whole process had happened that quickly that he did not have time to feel any pain. Plus, even if there had been anyone in the area at the time, which there wasn't, it is unlikely, because of the speed of the process, that they would have seen his abduction. They may, of course, have heard the noise or even seen the bright light, but that is all. So, with no one seeing his abduction, no one was aware that Barry had been taken on board this alien ship, and therefore no one was going to miss him. That was until he failed to return to help Ollie with that lunch he had promised her. Just before the very last part of Barry faded away into nothingness and he blacked out completely, the very last thought that ran through his mind seconds before his world went black was, "Oh my God, I'm being teleported aboard." Talk about beam me up, Scotty. And with that, Barry's great adventure had begun. Well, folks, that's the end of chapter 1. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to make any comments, as long as they're polite, do so in the comment section below. If enough people like it, then I will continue with further chapters. Because as you can imagine, it has taken quite a long time and a lot of effort to produce the chapter. So I don't want to be making more chapters if nobody wants to watch it. I will be publishing the book when it's finally finished, and we're fairly close to ending the book. So, yeah, that's it. If we do go on chapter 2 and so on, there'll be no long intro like there was with this one, and no long cut at the end, so no ending like there has been with this one. So hopefully you will like it and want more. So it's bye for now.